name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with David Harrelson. It's January 7th, 2026, and we're at Linfield University and Nicholson Library in McMinnville. And David, thank you so much for joining us today. First question, as you know, is why wine?
Well, thank you for having me and being able to share some of the story. Why wine? I live in Dundee is really the real quick short answer. We moved there in 2013, and I'm a really curious person. And so it was really probably only a matter of time, because every other person that I ran into that was new worked in the industry, had some connection, seemed to be related. You know, there's trucks driving up and down the road with grapes at harvest season. The smell that I now know as fermentation, right? Like, you move to town and you start to realize the rhythms and the feelings of what's going on. And wine is that in Dundee, as it is in much of the Willamette Valley. And so I was just drawn to it, curious. It became a part of all my conversations socially because people were in the industry. Yeah.
Let's talk about wine, life before wine a little bit. Tell us about where you're born and raised and kind of your early life.
Yeah, so I was born in Eugene, Oregon. We moved around a lot as a kid till about 8 years old. So I lived in Eugene, and I lived in Federal Way, and I lived in Kaiser, Oregon, where I started school. I went to Kennedy Elementary. And then we moved to Sitka, Alaska. And I lived on campus there and would just go out and play in the woods, which is amazing now with Google Maps, right? I can backtrack my geographies and yeah, I thought that I was way off in the woods, but I was like 3 miles from my house, right? As like an 8-year-old, basically just playing in the woods and building forts and mud pies and running across fish with their heads ripped off from bears, right? And just like truly a landscape where it wasn't abnormal to see beavers, or it wasn't abnormal to see a bear and just turn around and go the other direction. So it was really like, I also remember the fish being so thick in all the streams and the rivers that we could lay out on a culvert, reach our hands in the river, and just pick fish up by their gills. You could put the thumbs in the gills and just like throw a fish onto the bank. And so it was really powerful to be able to see what I felt like was a lot of the Northwest. But I realized by the time I was 18, while I had been all the way from Alaska to California, I'd never been more than 300 miles from the Pacific Ocean in the first 18 years of my life. So we moved around a lot when I was young. My parents divorced when I was young, when I was 3, and I was moving with my mom a lot until I was 8 years old. And then when I turned 8, I actually moved to live with my dad in Tacoma, Washington. And my mom's family is a real blue-collar family. One side from the Grand Round Indian Reservation, and my dad's family is a real white-collar family. And so I also sort of grew up in between those different worlds of like class and resources, money, worldly experiences versus local deep tide resources. My family, my grandmother worked at Chemawa Indian School as a teacher's assistant, and then helped establish the alternative school in Sheridan, Oregon. And her first husband worked at a scrapyard running the magnet crane. And he died young. He died in his 50s from a heart attack. But that was Eugene. That was our Eugene family. My dad went to University of Oregon. He met my mom at Taco Time, right? My mom worked at one of the first Taco Times, and that was that life. The Grand Round connection, so I would always go back and visit my grandma. My grandma lived in Grand Round, and as a tribal member, but also whenever I would go see my mom, even after living with my dad, I would come back to the reservation every summer and live for a couple weeks or a month. I would live at grandma's house. And that was really my continued grounding in the tribe. But I didn't grow up in community at the tribe. I grew up in Tacoma, and in Tacoma, I lived 4 blocks from a big pebble rock beach that I could skip rocks. I grew up among like madrona forests of the Puget Sound or the Salish Sea. I went to the high school that 10 Things I Hate About You was filmed in, which is kind of a cult classic, but it's an old railroad hotel. Its sister hotel would be the one in Banff that gets famous, and it's in a French chateau style of architecture. And it was also the high school that my grandparents went to. And I was sort of like a 4th child to my grandparents in a lot of ways, my dad's parents, and they were really active in civic and social life in Tacoma, and many of their elderly friends just actually thought I was their 4th child, even though like it doesn't math out correctly, right? Like they would have been like 55 when they had me or something like that. But I grew up around that, and my grandfather was a doctor. He had his own private practice, and then in the end of the 60s, after he already was a practicing doctor, he went back to school for public health at Berkeley. And he came back and he actually started the public health program for Tacoma school districts and built that, and was a part of the team creating the Inside and Out series, which was this really famous health series in the 70s. And my grandfather was sort of the like crazy sideburn doctor in it, who like gives the doctor professional opinions. But they won an Emmy for the Inside and Out series. And when you ask him, that was pretty cool, but what was the best part about it? He said, well, we beat Mr. Rogers that year for children's programming. And he had the highest regard for Mr. Rogers and like the programming that was provided. So the big deal for him was like, I kind of knew it was good when we beat Mr. Rogers. He went on to finish his career after that as vice president for Weyerhaeuser. And so as a kid, I got to grow up in the National Weyerhaeuser headquarters in Federal Way, the big beautiful rhododendron garden, the really interesting architecture. I got to go visit Grandpa at work before he retired in the early 90s. And that was really meaningful to me, but it showcased many different ways of knowing and being. Because I have family members who worked in the woods. I had family members that worked the green chain line at the plywood mill. I had family members who worked scrapyard, who were educators, who were executives. And that was like, whenever I was going around to different holiday meals or dinners, it was varied. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you said at 18, you realized you'd never been too far from the ocean. So I'm curious what you did next.
Yeah, 6 days after graduating high school, I got on an airplane and spent a month in Peru. And it was a wild adventure that was a really wonderful time. I had to do all the coordination by myself. No one in my family, my dad especially, is a real homebody. And so it was sort of like, I guess we're okay with that, but we don't really know what it is. And I was like, it's something I just got to do. And I had a friend that I went to high school with whose mother was Peruvian, and they wanted a travel companion. And so I was like, what an amazing opportunity. So it was some independent travel, but it was also staying with their family in different areas of the country, from Lima to Arequipa. We went out to Cusco. We flew over and spent a number of days in Puerto Maldonado at the headwaters of the Amazon. Went to Machu Picchu, stayed overnight, got to wake up in the morning and actually like be there before the train arrives with all the tourists. So it was like being in Machu Picchu with like 2 dozen people. It was really powerful and gets your head starting to move that like the world's a little bit different than what it can look many different ways. Yeah.
What was next for you?
Yeah, I guess I would say growing up, a couple really important things probably in my own development. My dad was a mountaineer. He was really active in the Mountaineers organization. And so we didn't go on vacation. We went into the woods. And so I grew up in the woods of, the Cascades and the Olympics. and Mount Rainier, and spending a lot of time around there doing those sorts of things. And that really prepared me to become a trip leader for the YMCA. I was really, as a young youth, my grandfather encouraged me to go to Camp Seymour, which is a YMCA camp associated with the Tacoma YMCA. And I did counselor in training, and then I became like a trip leader, leading like canoe trips, or short 2-day, 3-day kayak canoe trips. And in high school, also connected to that, me and a couple friends started our high school outdoor club. So we were like, we need to provide these opportunities to our other fellow classmates to like get outside and go do stuff. And so that sort of set me on this trajectory of like hanging out with a bunch of fellow dirtbags that, spend time out in the woods, out in the country. But when I went to college, I went to college at Lewis Clarke College in Portland, and I lived on the outdoor pursuits floor and was active in that, but I was also a rower. I was on the rowing team for the 4 years that I was there. I studied abroad in East Africa, which was a big part of probably a story, which maybe we'll eventually get to, but that experience in East Africa is probably why I work, or why I built a career and came back and worked for my tribe specifically. When we were on that trip, a lot of people are having these moments of like, wow, there's a lot of need in the world, I can contribute, and feeling empowered in that way. And many of my fellow classmates that I was in that program with went and everything from, now they're PhDs after doing biological research, in East Africa, to like aid organizations or working in the nonprofit sphere. And for me, I just looked around and was like, all the things that I'm seeing and the big feelings are all things that exist back home. And I know what it means to belong to a place, and I'm already obligated. So there's no question about it. I just need to go home, and I need to contribute to my community, which is the Confederated Tribes of Grand Round. What else about college? Oh, because we're talking about wine, one of the first wine memories that I sort of have, we didn't grow up drinking wine. That wasn't a part of my real upbringing. Maybe, holiday meals or something small, some New Zealand Sauv Blanc or something, I think was my grandmother's favorite wine. But we were in college, and my roommate had decided that we needed to watch all Godfather movies in a row, like a classic.
Even the third one?
All of them. Even the third one. Had to watch the third one. And got a bunch of wine, because the only way to properly do it was to drink red wine the entire time. And so we spent a whole weekend doing nothing but drinking big bottle, inexpensive red wine and watching the Godfather trilogy, which was probably like one of my early core memories of personally with wine. But also in those travels on my way back from East Africa, where I spent about 3-4 months studying abroad, but then I took a month to be in Europe before spring term started. And I got a lot of really wonderful opportunities. I think me and one of my teammates from college and roommates who was also on the trip with me, we traveled to about 7 different countries in that month. And a couple of the real highlights were we met up with his parents outside of Lemieux. And we drank sparkling and cooked food as shut in this small winter village called Bourriage in a tiny little town in France, which was all his parents imagining. We were just like, oh yeah, we're gonna be tired and we wanna hang out with you. And so we just cooked and drank really good wine. But what a weird way to be introduced to the world of sparkling, right? Whereas everyone thinks champagne, and I'm like, Lemieux, you gotta see the sparkling from Lemieux. It's absolutely amazing, because for a week of my young, limited exposure to wine world, we just drank sparkling from Lemieux, and it was amazing.
So you talked about being in East Africa and having this kind of revelation of that, that this is something that you want to go forward with back home. Tell me about what that meant to you at that point. What you thought you could contribute, what you thought you might do with your life.
Yeah, up to that point, after my first year of college, so I traveled abroad my junior year. But after my freshman year, I wanted to be a wildland firefighter. It seemed of interest because I had all this backwoods experience, time in the mountains. I was drawn to like the physicality of that work, and it seemed really interesting. And so I mentioned it. My mom was like, "Oh, I just read a tribal newspaper story that we have our own fire crew." And at that time they were down, they did a big news coverage because they were deployed to the Biscuit Fire. The Biscuit Fire was one of the largest fires in Oregon history, down on the southwest Oregon coast. And she was like, "You should don't work for the Forest Service, work for the tribe." And I was like, "Oh, sure." And at that time, this is maybe my grandfather's influence, I write a formal letter of introduction, right? And I send it to the natural resources manager. And then my uncle finds out about it and is like, "What are you doing? That's not how the tribe works." It's like, "I know them. You just come out here and I'll drive up there and you'll just go meet them." And so sure enough, I do that, but I get to the door and he's like, "Oh, you're the guy that sent me the letter," weird, right? And so it's sort of this funny enigma of formality. And I got on the crew, I worked in the woods that summer, the next summer. And so I sort of had that pathway and understanding when I was there to say, well, I'm already working during the summers for the tribe. There's opportunities there, even if it's just keeping working. And I ultimately was a wildland firefighter for 8 seasons. 7 of those seasons were with Grand Round, and 1 season I worked with the Prineville Hotshots out of Central Oregon. And I still get the opportunity in some of my work and my capacity today to support cultural fire, prescribed fire, the idea that fire is the most powerful tool that we as humans have and always have had to manage the ecosystem and in the environment. And so that's really powerful to see how I can support both younger tribal members that are still maintaining being firefighters, but also just making it more accessible, where we have kids and we have elders actually using fire to manage important cultural plants and resources in our homelands. But yeah, it might be a good time to just explain that I've come into wine to make wine, and there's a wild story related to Georgia. But it's a side quest for me, really. It's this hobby that has consumed me, and I'm curious about it, and I'm itching for it. But I have a whole career working for the tribe, and I've worked for over 21 years now for the Grand Round tribe. I started in wildland fire, and then I got into cultural resources work, so archaeology. And in 2016, I became the department manager. And we operate Chichalu Museum and Cultural Center, which I helped open in 2018 and build the team for that. And we also have a historic preservation office that does regulatory government compliance work throughout the tribe's homelands in Western Oregon. That was sort of where my work was as I came up through the program. I kind of held each of the positions that exist now before becoming the department manager. But we've been active in creating a research center for the tribe, which has access to the tribal archives, and we've been active in most recently standing up a tribal art program where we're actually doing public art to promote the indigenous art forms of place here in Western Oregon. And so I think for a lot of people it's like, well, what do you mean you wine and this? And there's a connection. There's a little bit of a bridge to get there. But one, it's just place-based. All of my work is, we use this term called placekeeping, and it's place-based. And inherently for me, this place is becoming known all around the world for these really curious, inspiring people that are making wine. And so there's an aspect of this that I feel an obligation and a calling to bring cultural knowledge of place from the Willamette Valley, because that's what my career has been based in, is like knowing where the village sites are, knowing where the gathering, knowing the storied landscape, knowing the names of individual, like indigenous names of drainages and rivers and areas of the valley. And like, it's a whole cultural geography and a framework of knowing and being and living. And for all these people that care so deeply about place, and even, I mean, they inherently care about it, but also their work is branded in a way that aligns with it, there's a huge gap and a disconnect between the two. And I'm really interested in being an ambassador and a bridge for that. It's helpful to have my own project in doing that, because it's the pathway into engaging in community. And that kind of goes back to the question of why wine. Well, why wine is like, people gather around wine, people commune around wine, and in that way, some of the best parts of our humanity can surround what happens around wine, because it's a convener. And that's really powerful to me. Also, this idea that it is a product that can be scalable, right? When I do a public talk or I share a story about something, it's finite, right? Maybe 40 people come to a public talk. Maybe it's really cool and 400 people eventually see it. But the idea of making a product that has a story, and then the ability to produce that at a scale of 100 cases, 200 cases, 1,000 bottles, right? 20,000 bottles, that carries story in a really powerful and impactful way that can scale. As an individual person that speaks or lectures or does these other things, you don't quite have the same scalability and reach. Also, within our community, we've come to talk a lot about how there's infinite knowledge. Oftentimes, if knowledge is water and everyone has a cup, their cup is only so big. The more water that you pour into that cup doesn't make the cup bigger, right? It just overflows. But what makes people make their cups larger is curiosity. And so doing things that spark people's curiosity so that their cup's larger, so that then when there's information to be shared, or what's most relevant to share by having a conversation with them, so you're giving informed information, that's really helpful. And so this journey towards why wine, well, I live in Dundee, but I'm always a really curious person. I was a beekeeper, right? I would say I have 2 young children. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. I have a little bit less room for curiosity than I had before that. But there's a number of projects through the years. I had 5 beehives until they almost killed me because I had an allergic reaction. I've been stung about 50 times. You can build up an allergy to bee stings. And so I got rid of my honeybees. And then this tea project started. So it should be noted that another project that I have is the Dundee Hills Tea Garden, which has its own Instagram, where we're doing my wife and I are doing a test plot of 500 Camellia sinensis plants to test, to essentially see the viability of growing tea in this region. And we're anticipating our first full harvest this spring, which will only get more and more as it goes along. But it's just a side, but flavor and interest has always sort of been there for me. All of my curiosities were turning into work projects because we're based here in the Willamette Valley. Well, my people are from here, and so I would get curious about this aspect of something or this aspect, and then it would become too close to align to work, and it didn't seem like I was getting a break from work to be able to balance these things. And that's kind of what beekeeping was about. It's a little bit about what tea was. And then oddly though, everything's interconnected, and so it kind of points back. Well, on one of these journeys, I had a theme where I'd get a new cookbook from some area of the world every 6 months, and I'd try to cook food from it for the 6 months and then get a new cookbook and sort of go through these things. So, Greece, and went here, and I ended up getting a Georgian cookbook, the Republic of Georgia. And I suddenly realized that I had somehow missed this whole gap of like global food culture knowledge. It wasn't like anything that I had interacted with. And then I got really curious and interested because I realized like, oh my gosh, the Republic of Georgia is in between Russia, Iran, Turkey, right? It's in between empires. It's in between the Roman and the Persian Empire. It's in between the Russians and the Byzantines, right? Or the Eastern Romans. It is on the edge of Turkey and Armenia, right? You have this, and just realizing these are people that have maintained their culture through being on the edge of everyone else's empire, but they have a unique identity. They have one of the few their own language scripts in the world, but they're a population of 4 million. They're a population of about the size of Oregon, yet it's a country the size of South Carolina that has over 36 microclimes, everything from tropics to like desert to high mountain terrain. And I got real interested about that, and then learned like, oh, they have their own wine, why I originally got the cookbook was because I asked the question, there's all these grapes all around me. Well, I do archaeology. Where's the oldest wine archaeology? And, debatable. People like to go back and forth. Georgia claims it. There's some stuff in Armenia and Western China. And so I was like, oh, I want to learn about that. And you quickly learn that the oldest winemaking traditions aren't barrels, they're clay vessels. And that was really interesting because I recalled that I knew somebody who was making clay vessels. And the connection to that, which is super odd, and it was the first time of consciousness of like grape growing in Oregon, was I was sitting in a history of the American West class with Stephen Dow Beckham, Dr. Stephen Dow Beckham, who taught at Linfield for a few years before he went and had a whole career at Lewis Clarke College, where he ended up being my advisor. I was a history major in school. And he was talking to us at the beginning of the class about how proud he was of his new granddaughter, Sophia, and his son, who was ripping out all of these tree stumps and establishing a vineyard. Well, years down the road, about 15 to 20 years later, I realized that Andrew, who spent a career in addition to creating this wine business, being the ceramics teacher at Beaverton High School for 20 some odd years, he's making clay vessels. And I know his dad. I still get to do research with his dad all the time in my day-to-day job. We do contracts and we do collaborative work. And so, and I think we had become club members of the Beckhams like a number of years before that. And so it was just this natural fit. And I was like, Andrew, like what? I got to talk to somebody about clay vessels. And it was really powerful for me to be able to share and talk about that. And he's been one of my encouraging people along the way as I start things, including being able to work with me so that I can make my first vintage in one of his clay novums. And so I'm really proud that one of my first wines, an amber wine, is made that. And I feel like it tells a story of that familial relationship that I have with his father as one of my teachers and advisors, but also Andrew and I have become friends over the years and share meals and have conversation. And he's got kids off at college now, the same Sophia that I heard about as being a newborn while the vineyard was being planted is now at OSU. Right? And so that's sort of a powerful familial relationship through time and encouragement in the wine industry.
So before we get into wine any further, I want to talk a bit about your day job. You talked about what it was. Tell me a little bit about, as you've sort of progressed with the tribe, What are some of the, you mentioned kind of some of the things you had opened, some of the things you'd done. What are some of the accomplishments that you're proud of? What are some of the interactions you've had or memorable moments from kind of the work you've done with the tribe?
Yeah. This sort of is a shortcut cheat answer, but I remember shortly in about 2018, I went back to Washington, D.C. to present at the energy department was having a big conference. And we had just done this work to get the Grand Round Depot listed on the National Register. And I had the opportunity to work with this amazing person at National Park Service named Lisa DeLine. And I wanted to meet her in person, and I was in DC. So she said, yeah, of course, like come up to the offices. And we went to lunch, and I just told her about all the things that we were doing. Work like the Tribal Cultural Landscapes Initiative, where we've developed a whole framework for mapping and documenting cultural geographies from tribal perspectives in ways that can be shared with regulators and stakeholders. To individual projects like the sculpture at George Rogers Park in Lake Oswego, the man from Kosciuszko, and actually taking a traditional story told by one of our elders in 1920s, inspiring an artist to develop a piece that then marks place that tells the traditional story about how to cook and prepare eels, right? And these are just like two examples, but there was at least 6 to 12. And she looked at me and she said, David, if I did one of those projects working for National Park Service, it would be like a lifetime achievement. I couldn't hope to accomplish because of the bureaucracy, because of the challenges of working within a government. Like the tribe is this place where you're able to like do. And it's like where the rubber meets the road and ideas and movement, and there's enough resources to make things happen, but there isn't so much bureaucracy that like good ideas can never like flourish. And so, you know, we've grown since 2016 from a team of around 12 to 27. And for me, that growth is we've been able to manage there's that many more people who are getting fulfilled lives of being at the intersection of creating relevance and meaningfulness in their work. And the scale of that is just really awe-inspiring. Another maybe project that I've been more directly involved with throughout the lifespan of it and supporting it is the Chimpinafu Lecture Series, which is a partnership in Corvallis of a really wonderful person, Dave Eckert, who essentially organizes and works with me to each year have 3 different public speaking engagements. And we partner with the Corvallis-Benton County Library to put those online. And so there's webinars, they're in person, but there's a whole YouTube channel for Chimpinafu. It's CHAMPINEFU. And that means the place of the Ampinafu people. And the Ampinafu are the Marys River Kalapuya. And when you're in Kalapuya country or the Willamette Valley, Cha means the place of something. Sometimes it's spelled CH, sometimes it's spelled TCH. So Chehalem is the outside place. Chehalem means the outside place because the contrast to it is the inside place. And the inside place is the area that runs Patton Valley all the way down to where Gaston is, the old Wapato Lake, which were drained, the lake beds, and they grew onions there. And then subsequently in the last few decades, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been purchasing land and trying to reactivate that as a wetland. But that's the inside place because that's where all the winter villages were for the Tualatin Kalapuya, the band of Kalapuya that lived in this northern area. And there's numerous named villages around the outside of that place. Like on the south end of the lake near Flett Road, there's a village there that was called Chattagilth, and Chattagilth means the fir bark place, right? And so you get these Champui State Park means the place to dig yampa root, right? Chamawa which the Indian school is named after the water feature to the northeast known in the community as Lake Labish. But Lake Labish was a chamawa, which is a generic term to describe like a flooded lake environment. So if you're ever driving out Highway 6 from Forest Grove towards Tillamook, there's a big area of water off to your right. That would be a chamawa, right? That's these different ways of knowing and being across the landscape that are just really curious, and gets back to that earlier comment that I made about how do we get that place-based grounding for people who are living and operating in these spaces and thinking about them, because our vineyard workers, our wine growers, they're on the land. They're thinking about land in a lot of the ways that people that are just driving by on the highway, they aren't. And so, yeah, that interests me.
Tell me a little bit about the sort of the future for your work. What is there to be done still? What are you excited about that's coming next?
Yeah, at the tribe, this last summer we changed our constitution, and we moved from a membership that was based on blood quantum to descendancy. And so what that means is that we are going to see an increase in our membership. We've capped the number of people that can be enrolled each year, but now it's no longer based on the Western constructed blood quantum. It's based on lineal descent. And we're anticipating that over the next 10 years, we'll have at least 2,000 more members enrolled. Whereas presently it's been a lot more about replacement. There's around 6,000 tribal members. And so, we'll go up to 8,000 tribal members roughly anticipated, or maybe 7 with people passing away. Civic education is going to be a really big thing in our future, because the only way that we make a future where tribal members are resources and not seen as liabilities, meaning, sort of the equivalent of more mouths to feed, is if they're informed and knowledgeable and engaged about who the tribe is. And so really I feel like the foundations of what I've wanted to do as the manager, where I've had a limited degree to make a certain amount of decision, was establish our research center so that we have continuity over time, and we have a person that can support both internal and external research requests. Which we've achieved. Establishing an art program, we're really driving towards trying to have there's an art form of this place. There's indigenous art forms. You don't have to go to the Southwest or to the islands in Alaska to get to a Northwest Native American art form. We didn't have totem poles here, but there's a really rich artistic tradition of the lower Columbia River and northern Willamette Valley. And that art form, and then the art form of our neighbors, is things that we're working to really draw out so that it's recognized within our region as the place-based art form that it is. And so we're doing that through supporting artist capacity. So, there's many creative people, but it doesn't mean that those many creative people have a portfolio that would support them getting a public art commission. And for the most part, when we look at where funding is available to support the arts, it's either small $2,000, $5,000 grants, or it's $100,000, $200,000 art project. And so we have to bridge the gap and make sure that there's enough tribal artists that have progressive responsibility and opportunities to be able to be competitive for those large art pools. And we're having success, which is really wonderful, and we're starting to see some of these installations come through, which maybe now is a good time to mention. I've been in the pursuit of establishing that art program. So the future is growing that, but I've been an Oregon Arts Commissioner since 2020, and I'll finish my second term as an Oregon Arts Commissioner in 2028. And so I've been active, not only creating our program and active here in Western Oregon, but also trying to make sure that other tribal people and not within our homelands are also aware of that, so that we can do efforts to lift the tide for everybody. One of those ways that's going to be seen most significantly is in the renovations of the Capitol building in Salem. Tribal artisans have been selected throughout for the public art that's a part of that. And when it opens, there's going to be really exceptional examples of Native art in the Oregon Capitol building from tribes across the state of Oregon, from artists that are, Umatilla and Coquille, and Kuslorm Kwasayusla. We're really excited to see that life get breathed and in a very visual way. One of the things that I've been saying is that as a minority within our own homelands, we have to do things that are magnifiers, and that's why tribal public art is so valuable, is that it holds a place in our homelands that reminds people that we still exist, that we're still here. Well, we only have 6,000 members. Only about 2,500 of them live locally within the area. We have members that live in 47 states of the United States, 3 countries of the world, right? We have tribal members that are citizens of other countries. So the complexity of that just means that public art becomes more broadly representative, like it's a magnifier, which maybe that also helps people understand when I'm thinking about it that way. There's an element of wine too. And there's all of this work that's happening in wine where people are being intentional and caring and being curious and interested, that it's a really receptive place. But it's also a place that I don't believe that the tribe will ever go, because alcohol's also done a lot of harm in our tribal communities. And a lot of families or individual people don't have a lot of healthy relationships with alcohol modeled for them. And that's something that we sort of have to grapple with. It's something that I, in establishing a wine label, will have to grapple with. And I've done that in a couple of ways that I'm thinking about. One is that I think it is deserving to be able to demonstrate and an obligation to show healthy relationships with alcohol, and to ensure and encourage people to also be constantly in reflection about what is a healthy relationship with alcohol. And at the same time, it's not new, right? I might be the first person of this place as an Indigenous person to be a winemaker. I'm friends with Brandy Gray, who's wonderful and has been really encouraging from Gray Wing. And she's our first Indigenous winemaker of the Willamette Valley. And she lives here now, and she's made this her place, her home, and she's the best type of guest that you want, because she's making this place her home, but she's not Indigenous of this place. And so while I bring that to the table, I'm also not the first person. I'm just the first person to be legal, right? So it's I've got my OLCC and my TBB, and it sounds like a rap session or something like that with all the acronyms. But we have an area on the reservation called Wine Alley. And I named one of the first wines that I made in the 2024 vintage, my Wine Alley Red. And a part of that is this response to when people say, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, well, I'm doing something new, but it's not really new. This area on the reservation has been known for generations as Wine Alley. And it's Wine Alley because people were making wine on Wine Alley, right? And that's just how it is. So there's a little bit of that guiding and bringing people along for the story that's also theirs. And there's a word that there's an exhibit hall in Chichalu, our museum, that's called Chindudats. And Chindudats is a Santiam Kalapuya word. Santiam are the people near the Santiam River, central Kalapuya. And it means to find with intent and purpose. And we call that gallery hall that because we don't presume that there's a process of finding. It's not that you just know everything, right? And that's the other thing that's so amazing to me about wine. When you meet winemakers or other people who know tons and tons and tons, they're not oftentimes less curious. They're even more curious because of all the variables. If anything, the challenge is to restrict and make considered choices about how to deal with large amounts of variability and options. And that just resonates to me in a big way. But you find with intent and purpose as you sort of move through and seek. And so that is, that's what I'm doing. The main inspiration for me, I guess I kind of grew up thinking of wine as like class-based, maybe pretentious. And even moving here at first, I wasn't convinced that it wasn't that way. But I ultimately went on a trip to Georgia. I had a newborn child. I was beyond obsessed with Georgia. There was a Georgian food restaurant that opened in Portland called Cargi Go-Go. It's now closed, sadly, but it was in the Alberta neighborhood. I had started to become a regular there, and my wife saw that they were going to partner with somebody to do a food and wine trip to Georgia, a 10-day food and wine trip to Georgia, which I've always been like a dirtbag backpacker when I traveled, because when I was a firefighter, I would fight fire and then travel during the winter, and I was always on the cheap, right? So the idea is like utter luxury to like go on a trip, like a tour, like, oh my gosh. But also it was like, things are, you know, I've got my career, like it's established, but I knew there was no way that I could ask. Like I was literally gonna have like a 9-month-old child at home. And so I was just like, man, what an amazing opportunity. Well, around my birthday, my wife goes, you know, you should go on that trip. As like, she gave me something that I couldn't ask for. And it was a huge gift. And so I ended up going in the fall of 2019. And what I found there completely inspired me. I couldn't not come home, and I had to make wine. And I had to make wine because what I found was this community where everyone made wine in their garage. It was a crazy informal wine culture. What I also found was amber wine didn't have to be like natty. It could be precise and it could be good, and it wasn't just an excuse to sell flawed wine. And not sending too much shade out there, but that's also the guide. Like why I'm making wine is to make amber wine. I make other things because I can't just only make amber wine. I'm too curious to make these other things. And I say amber wine, not orange wine, because amber wine is what the Georgians make. They don't make orange wine. Like orange wine is another movement that is a little bit more Western European based in their like thought process in this. It's inherently tied more to the natural wine movement. And amber wine gets to piggyback on some of that and like what's happening. But my real draw to that style of making wine with skin contact from white grape varietals is the amber wine tradition of clay vessels and of technically precise non-flawed wine. And it's not, right? Like, I love me a farmhouse ale too, right? But if you have lactobacillus going on in your ferment, it might not, it's a different type of wine. It's just a different thing. And I also tasted those wines in Georgia, right? That's something that Georgia and their winemaking tradition, like they're working on, they're figuring that out, like that exists. But there's a whole nother body of things. What is maybe the greatest limitation is I don't have access to Georgian grape varietals. And Georgian grape varietals are their whole other thing of absolutely beautiful, like ricotta skelly, and you have Kisi and Kikavi, and you have these Chinuri. Chinuri is this like cold climate, delicate, absolutely stunning, beautiful white wine that the Soviets almost eradicated because it isn't a high yield grape. And so with the collectivization of farms, it was only being maintained in like people's individual backyard family like stands because it wasn't the producer the way that ricotta skelly and these others were. And so yeah, the story of empire, the story of all these things come into varietals. I think over time. We do have some of those grape varietals growing in the United States. The Finger Lakes region is known to make some really beautiful early Georgian plantings. Have happened there in that location. There's some small plantings in Washington of some red varietals like Saperavi and other things, but kind of digress.
Well, so you're on this trip and you have this revelation, you have this now need to make wine. So tell me about the next step. Tell me about figuring out how that's going to happen for you.
Yeah, so that was the other part is like I was seeing in Georgia, it was like people were just going to vineyards and getting like trash bags full of grapes, right? Like they don't have like macro bins, right? If anything, they use like milk carton crates, like their own equivalent of like produce crates and stuff. And it was just sort of mind-boggling where I'm thinking back home and I'm thinking of like macro bins loaded on the back of a flatbed with just huge abundance. And there it's like they just dump the grapes in a huge, the equivalent of like a dump truck, right? And it was so different, but I was like, I got to be able to shake some grapes loose from somebody. These trucks are driving by all the time. But fortunately, I came back. I was sharing about my travels, cooking, making food for friends. And one of those friends is Siler Varnum, who owns Varnum Vintners. And Siler has been a good friend since 2014. We have children that are about the same age, but we famously met at the hat party, as is known. Jim McGuire, who's worked in the wine industry in many different places around the valley. It was Jim's birthday, and my next door neighbor, Shannon Green, who worked at Cliff Creek and then worked at Dobbs and now works at Bryn Mawr. Wonderful friends, best neighbors you can have, her and her husband, Travis. And she was throwing a birthday for Jim. And who showed up but Terilyn and Siler Varnum, like their first year of making wine. And it's called the Hat Party because we had purchased all of these hats for my 30th birthday because we were going to play this board game called Diplomacy, if you've ever heard of it. It's kind of like Risk on steroids. And we were going to make everyone choose their country and then wear a hat from the country. So we had like the Soviet military hat, we had the French artist beret, right? We had like a ridiculous Austrian, like Austro-Hungarian, like military cap. There was the Fez cap for Turkey. I forget what Britain was, right? But Tam or something like that, right? Just absolutely ridiculous. So we were having this party, and for whatever reason, I just went and grabbed the bag of hats. And so then we're like having a birthday party, but then all the hats come out. So there's all these ridiculous pictures. And it was also a foundation that Terilyn's grandmother was there, who's an absolutely amazing person who's actually going to be moving to their vineyard this spring. So if you go visit Varnum Vintners, say hi to Grandma. And Grandma is amazing, but it was a lesson. It's a goal of mine to now always try to have 3 generations at any party that I'm at, because it makes it infinitely better and more fulfilling and insightful, and the depth of the conversations that happen. And so, that just general principle, like, is something really worth doing if you can't have 3 generations be there, is kind of a working question. And Grandma is our eldest, in her 90s now, who's regularly a part of different gatherings that we have. So I think I was one of the first people to buy a case of wine from Siler Varnum. I bought a case of Riesling where I tasted his 2014 Riesling, and on the spot I was like, I want a case. And he was like, whoa. So I think we're within he eventually created a club and he gave us like honorary status as one of the first 5 people in the Varnum's club. So Siler is a huge part of that journey. So of course when I got back, I was like, Siler, like, how do I get a couple 100 pounds of grapes from you? And I was able to buy some grapes off him and, go down and get my big white plastic tubs from, the wine supply store and glass carboys. And then, this all happened in the 2020 vintage where the pandemic happened. So not only am I doing that, but I'm at home more. I'm in my garage. I get to see my friend Siler because I'm getting grapes from him, but we're still all social distancing as I'm like getting my grapes in the door. And it was, some people baked bread or learned how to bake bread during the pandemic. Well, I started making wine in my garage. And yeah, that was the first year. It was also the smoke year. It was the heat dome year. I mean, what a year. That year at my house, it got to 117 degrees in our backyard. The blueberries actually cooked on the bushes, right? So like in the way that if you put berries in the microwave, they would start to break down or something, like that happened on our blueberry bushes, I remember, in that heat dome event. Really abnormal. But yeah, those are some of the things from 2020 that I sort of remember. And then I continued sort of at that scale for 2 or 3 years, making 10 cases of wine in my garage. My challenge is that I always, probably like any winemaker, if you talk to them, they always want to do more ferments, right? But then more ferments are more things to manage, and you're trying to balance this. But it was helpful to help guide me in what I would eventually do by only having 5-gallon projects, right? Because it helped me assess like what white grape varietals do I want to do skin contact with. And it was in those early test years that I really came out with my stars, which are Albarino and Gewürztraminer, are the 2 grape varietals that I'm really driven to and interested in what sort of skin contact wines those can make. And how they blend together is also particularly special. The minerality from Albarino and the floral notes, all while having like savoriness and textural qualities. Like that Gewürztraminer brings so much more of like a heavier palate into the wine that there's something there that really works in lieu of not having access to Georgian grape varietals. It's sort of, right, it's sort of my like pulse about it, but yeah.
Tell me about the process of learning to make wine. What was it like what you expected, and what were the kind of the happy discoveries along the way?
Yeah, way easier than beer. That is, you have a higher alcohol content, so there's like greater, the wines are better protected by the higher alcohol that's going on. And so, those at an earlier time in my life with friends, I had always tried to brew beer, and I was always tasting like medical gauze right? And you're like, this is gross. I can't believe I spent $45 on things to make this. It was just always frustrating. Like, I never really got it figured out with beer. So I was sort of anticipating like, oh yeah, this is gonna be, it's really hard and costly comparatively to make very good wine. I think there's a lot more give to make pretty good wine. And that is probably also my own observation, really driven by the things that are happening in the vineyards. Right, and the quality of the grapes that are like generally available and what's going on, which, my ancestors that are making wine in Wine Alley probably didn't have the same thing going on, but just the ready availability of fruit that is of quality. And if you understand what it was cropped at, if you understand, the pick and the numbers behind what's coming in the door, if you're willing to adjust, knowing with what you're receiving, you can choose to make wine in a good style. Yeah, if you come in and say, I want to make this exactly this way, and whatever fruit get in, you try to make it that way. Yeah, it's not going to work. But especially in those early learning years, where it's like I'm just making wine for myself, for my family. I don't have to sell it. I don't have to do these different things. It's like you just do that. You talk to people, you get an understanding, you kind of bridge. And so, having people like Andrew, but really Siler along the way to sort of like encourage and mentor and stop by and be able to be like, hey, this is going on, what's there? A little bit of sulfur also goes a long way. right? In both ways, like it's a wonderful protective. I remember that's the other thing that happened just living in Dundee, that curiosity, right? It's like people call you up and they're like, hey, can you come work the sorting line? And you're like, oh yeah, sure, I've never done it. Oh yeah, no worries, right? And so it's like throughout those years from 2013 to 2019, I had like worked a sorting line, helped people unload fruit, like just because it's the neighborly thing to do. You get to know people, your friends, you do this. And so there was exposure to that type of thing. And through that, you know, I saw different things. Things don't always go according to plan. In fact, they never go according to plan. I remember a particular instance where somebody had purchased fruit and was bringing it back from Eastern Washington. And like they got there and they opened the Penske truck and like there's just grape juice flowing. Like the bins they had holes in them, right? Somehow the grapes had been like crushed. They show up, first fruit, you know, arrive is the first fruit in the press. They're backlogged, like 4 presses behind other people that are making wine in this facility, and they have grapes that are like vulnerable grapes. They've lost probably a fifth of the juice that's spilled out all over the back is just actively flowing out of the truck. And you know, these are small producers. Like that's a big portion of their even sales. And I remember just like, well, that's not good. But they just like took sulfur and like spread sulfur over. They put it in the coolest place that they could, and like they made the best of it. And 2 years later, we're drinking the wine, and it's good. You know, you're like, and that wasn't the Varnums, by the way. I'm not talking about, not to tell other people's stories, but like things just don't always go according to plan. And that's a big part of what's so admirable about established winemakers and seeing that is that you have these really dynamic people who understand enough about all the inputs, but then they're flexible and they're adaptable. Like if you're rigid, like you will be broken. It's just not how it works. Which in that way, it reminds me a lot more of like creativity and art. Yeah, there's science to it and how you apply that science, but there's an immensely expressive like person aspect to winemaking, and I think you can see that in the industry. Yeah.
So tell me about making the jump from a few cases in your garage for family and friends to commercial winemaking.
Yeah, so I've got little kids, and once again, you never know when the fruit's going to get there. Like even if you know the pick is happening, you never really know when it's going to be there. And so after numerous nights of hand de-stemming grapes till 1 a.m. in my garage, where even my wife is like, I'm out, right? Like, I'm not helping you, like, we are done. I was sort of like hanging out at wineries and being like, I'm putting in way more time to hand process everything and do this because I'm doing it at a scale that I can't use a distemmer, that I have to use this tiny little basket press, and I'm doing all this stuff, and I'm like, you know, it'd be a lot. I actually think it would take me less total time to make wine in barrels, and then I'd actually have enough that I could sell it. Which might cover some of the costs of this. Well, I'm more or less still in that elaborate journey of figuring that out, which I don't know if it'll quite pencil out at the 150 case mark. Like once you establish a business, you do everything, you have to stand it up to be legal to sell everything. Like it's pretty hard to make those numbers like still all work. Especially when at the end of the day, a consumer, you know, sees your bottle of wine and somebody else, and it's a bottle of wine. So if somebody's making 20,000 cases of it compared to your 50 cases, it's still a $30 bottle of wine. It's not like, you know, you have economies of scale and you don't have the benefit of economy of scale. And so for me, I'm starting to realize as a new winemaker that like, it still may cost me in my first year or so. It's probably more the sweet spot as like a hobby plus side quest wine guy. is maybe the 250 to 500, but also you don't want to stretch into that without knowing that you can sell it, because then it's all loss. And some advice given to me along the way, Remy Drabkin, I'd shared with Remy, who's been a great friend of the tribe throughout the years, and I've gotten to know Remy, and she was just like, I love it. Making wine is a lot of fun, but the number one advice is you have to sell it. And I was like, that's great advice. Like, I need to hear that. And so, this will be my second production year. Custom Crush last year, where I was still helping out. Now I'm as an alternate proprietor, using the space at Varnum Vintners to make wine. And I sort of have a personal goal that if I need to sell X amount of wine by the end of March, and if I don't, I'm probably not going to make wine in the 2025 vintage. And I need to spend that time that I would be using to do that to focus on sales and learning what that is. Even though I've done a lot of program development, government ops side, reorganization, restructures, job description writing, like building something, it's a completely different thing to do it as a business. Because when I ask for money, the money gets awarded. I'm not trying to build revenue stream flows that then feed costs, and I'm actually really appreciating that, which is the small business skill sets that I can tell will be really impactful in my life, even if this ends up becoming only a multi-year side quest. Right, which, there's a potential of that. There is a potential also that it could become something more when I think about the future. I'm happy in my career. I have a job. I'm not looking to just jump into this career in wine. But, I could imagine it as a second career. I still am imagining that as a possibility. Yeah.
So once you start down that road, you have to come up with a name, you have to come up with labels, you have to come up with a design. Tell me about that process for you.
Yeah, so I had started that. I made some shiners in my first few years and sort of had a playful label that was called ICTA, which wasn't registered anywhere. I think I had the website. I think I probably still do. IKTA. And in the Chinnaquawa trade language, it means what? And the idea was, David's making wine? What? ICTA? Because that's what you'd say in Chinnaquawa, because it's that's weird. What? What'd you say? Say it again, ICTA? So ICTA was on the table as an option, but I was that's almost like an inside joke. And using a language, would we have it would be like a playful second label or something. And so the word that we chose for the wine business is Amaa, A-M-A-A, and Amaa means home in Kalapuya. And one of the things that I've been able to be exposed to and around is some of the people in the community working on Kalapuya language work. And one of the things that in the last few years that have come out is that the word for fire and the word for home in both the Kalapuya and Chinook languages on the Columbia River is Amaa. And it's interchangeable. So where fire is where home is. Where home is where fire, because fire is so integral to how you maintain things. And as we get further into the nuance and understanding and the dialogue, there's this realization in the indigenous languages of this place, there's a lot of directionality. So in the way that we have prefix and suffixes and they tell you things about past or this, well, within our language, there's directionality inherent in the words themselves. And oftentimes it's speaking to the center of something or away from it. And a part of what Amaa is about is you're getting at when you're inside of a building, when you're going to the center of something, it's the hearth. When you're outside of a building, to the center of something is to the river. And there's just this way of talking and thinking and knowing. And so for me, it was, well, the short answer, when pouring wine is, yeah, it means home. And I'm Kalapuya. My ancestors have been here for over 500 generations, right? We have memories of the Missoula floods, the flood event that filled this valley with 400 feet of water. And those things were told by our elders to people in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, over 100 years before geologists even talked about that being a geological event that happened in this place. So no, it's not new. Like, we say that we've been here since forever, since time immemorial. Our stories go back even further beyond the floods. Like, we have what we call Econom. Econom are our creation stories. And it's about how the world was shaped and how all those things come into play. And so it's just home. And that's a part of what I really hope to be able to carry and have the brand just talk about home. And so that I had decided that. And then I was told, actually by Brandy Gray, hey, David, you should really reach out to the Northwest Native Chamber. They have different programs to help establish businesses and do this. And so at her guiding and recommendation, I reached out and they were like, yeah, 100%. So they had an agricultural value added specialist, Dwayne Lane. And I got to meet with Dwayne and he was like, yeah, let me know. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to establish it myself. I'm going to do all this. And he goes, you can, but also I have some resources that can support a lawyer meeting with you and helping file your incorporation paperwork and making sure that you get it right so you don't have to make up things later. And he was also like, we have a great portfolio of different visual graphic artists if you're looking for that type of brand support. And I was like, really? He was like, yeah. And so it was like manna from the heavens where, to be perfectly honest, my first product might have looked a little bit more like my shiners, right? When they first came out, because it's just when you're making 100 cases of wine, the idea of absorbing a few $1,000s of additional cost, there's just no way that you're gonna cover that. And it's not like I'm coming in with, retirement 401k savings or something like that to pay for this project. It's sort of me saving side money for my side quest of interest. And so it really helped, I think, get it off in a professional way. So a wonderful artist out of Portland, Savina Monet. I got the opportunity to work with Savina, who worked with a lot of other branding, creation, and other things. And so we had a great meeting and we had a conversation about, how to kind of create a graphic identity for, and it settled out on these base labels that I have, which showcase the central Willamette River. But it's based upon LiDAR imagery, which is this mapping technology that shows micro-topography, and it can actually show historic river courses and how they've changed over time. And so when you look at the bottle itself, you have the ability to see an image that shows where the main stem Willamette of the river is today, the brightest white line, but then also all of the channels that the river has flowed in over 18,000 years since the Missoula floods, which I'll kind of hold up for the camera to see. But why the central Willamette Valley is because that's where my ancestors who signed the treaty are from. My ancestor Joseph Shengretta signed the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855 for the Santiam Kalapuya, and then when he came to the reservation, he was put forward as the headman and leader for the Marys River Kalapuya, which are the same language speakers. In Kalapuya, we have over 13 different tribes and bands, and there's northern, central, and southern Kalapuya language families. Which are sort of as different as European languages amongst themselves, somewhat mutually intelligible, but not entirely. But across Western Oregon, there's over 5 major language families of Indigenous people, and some of those languages are as different as French and Chinese. They're not all Romance languages, but Kalapuya people sort of have that clustering. And so the central Kalapuya kind of territory. And I'm just really grateful to be able to have something that like looks kind of visual and interesting, but then also the variability, like I'm able to change the color in that so it moves as an ombre. So this year's red wine has a red color. My amber wine, Coyote's Eyes, has an orange color to it. But yeah.
You mentioned Coyote's Eyes as the name of one of the wines. You obviously named your wines. Tell me about coming up with that and about maybe what's next in terms of types of wines, names, labels, things you want to try next.
Yeah. Coyote's Eyes is that, once again, this context of like, you're going through a sensory experience, you're tasting out a barrel, you're seeing like what's come to what it is. And I tasted the Gewürztraminer and I was like, it tastes like rose. It tastes like rose hips. That's like my context. And rose hips is like a traditional tea that we actively use of taking Nootka rose or bald hip rose. We dry those when we steep tea out of them, and there's times of the year ceremonial. They also, you know, scientifically they have vitamin C. Like it's a part of health and these other things. Well, I smelled it and I was like, this smells like rose hips. Well, why Coyote's Eyes? Well, Coyote's Eyes is our word, Talipus siaquis, means coyote's eyes, and it's what we call rose hips. And it's because our creation story, one of them, Coyote gets stuck inside of a tree, and he can't get out. He likes it so much inside of the tree that he stays long enough that it starts to close up. And then he can't get out. And so he's trying to get everyone to come help him. And the woodpeckers knock the hole a little bit bigger, but he still can't get out. And then ultimately, because Coyote's the creator figure, he's, you know, he's magic, he can do all these things. He disassembles his body and puts his individual body pieces out. But the first thing he puts out is his eyes. And while he's putting all the other body pieces out, Raccoon, Collis, comes and takes his eyes and runs away with his eyes. So he gets out, he puts his body all back together, and like he can't get his eyes back. So he reaches out and he grabs rose hips and he puts them in his eyes. And then his eyes become functioning and working again. It was important to me, like, I want to make something approachable. I don't want to use Talipus siaquis on a bottle. Like, it doesn't mean anything to people. So using Coyote's Eyes is a reference point that somebody might have, who then is like, what is that about? And then you can add this like other context into the world and like bring them along, because for your average everyday person, they're not going to leave, they don't have a place in their mind or their memory to hold Talipus siaquis. They do is Coyote's Eyes. So that's a little bit of what that's about, and it's inspired off of the things that I taste and like how that world like came together. The other part is that ultimately this is a blend of Albarino, which has a lot of minerality, so which is also sort of like tears, right? So in my mind I have this like rose hips meets minerality, which is like eyes. Like it just worked, and it was like I was tasting through and seeing that that's what I had and came about. But not only that, but it was something that I feel that I can continue to have.
You're talking about Coyote's Eyes, and it's something you want to keep doing in the future. So tell me a little bit about sort of continuing on that.
Yeah, so a part of it is to be responsive and reflective of what it is that I'm tasting. I feel like I've learned enough and had success now in 2 years of my Albarino and Gewürztraminer ferments that I'm going to continue to look for that. I'm imagining a future. This is also, it's all reflective. Can I actually sell it? Will I ever be able to support making more than one amber SKU? Or am I confined to only one amber SKU? My curiosity wants to make more than one amber SKU, partially to just show that like within amber wine, there is a spectrum of like what you can actually like what you're trying to create there's real differences in choices, right? And that, to me, that shouldn't be abstract to people, because we don't put red wine in that category, right? We think about the range of red wine and expression, and like how even with the same grape, like how you can, what a Syrah or a Tempranillo can look like in the spectrum of a Syrah and a Tempranillo, right? Like it can be varied like in an extreme way. And so I'm interested in that as a future. Yeah.
So you've talked a couple times about, you're still in the figuring out phase. Is this going to be a side project? Is it going to on-go? Is it going to grow? What would, if you get to the end of the project and you look back, what will have made it a success for you?
Yeah, to me, a success will be conversations within the industry. So the ability to potentially like ground people's knowing and connection to place, both industry and consumers, right? Like that, even the smallest contribution, whether it's, at the Alt Wine Festival, or whether it's about like showing up. Another real success for me would be seeing other Indigenous native winemakers come forward. I don't need to take up that spot. Somebody else can, like if it makes sense, and like being a conduit, just like Brandy has encouraged me, Brandy Gray, to like keep the foot in the door so that other people can come in right behind you. I think that that's really important. And what that looks like or how it looks like, if I'm so privileged to one day be able to provide the same type of guidance and mentorship that Siler Varnum has provided me, right? That would be, but not necessary, right? There's many different ways to encourage, and sometimes it's just showing that it can be done. How much easier was it for me to imagine doing what I'm doing because Brandy already did it, right? It's not, when you wear the burden and the weight of doing something for the first time, it's like, ooh.
You talked obviously about Siler and Andrew and some of your other supporters in the industry. Tell me about getting to know the industry and what your impressions have been of Oregon wines so far.
Yeah, what a generative, encouraging, like curious bunch of people. And from north to south, it's so welcoming. For my 40th birthday last year, I went to Southern Oregon. I realized like I didn't know a lot about Southern Oregon. I was curious about it, and we set off with a bunch of people that we make wine with and a few others to like do 4 days of intensive wine tasting throughout the Rogue River Valley. And Umpqua, we stopped at Abasella, we saw Greg, just wonderful, welcoming people who are curious and passionate and interested. I would say one thing that is maybe a cautious or an interest to me, and it's like anything through rapid change. And I feel like that's what, I moved to Dundee when there was a stoplight, and that happened only a year or two before I moved to Dundee. And that's, having a stoplight represents a lot of things for me in our little town of Dundee, because it's exactly what's happened of explosion. There was 200 wineries in Oregon when I moved to Dundee. There's over 800 wineries. So the apprehension that I'm expressing, I'm also a part of, right? Because I'm one of those 800 wineries now. Maybe we're at 900 in the state, but that is a huge rapid growth. And so for me, when I'm talking about place, when I'm talking about groundedness, when those are all the qualities that I'm interested in. Like I am hugely interested in Oregon as a place, as an idea, as a people, as a gathering. Like my civic belonging and my civic engagement is to Oregon. I see myself as an Oregonian almost before I see myself as a tribal member. Definitely before I see myself as an American, right? It's one of my main affinities of belonging is as an Oregonian. And so with rapid growth and exchange, it pushes the idea of like the apprehension, or what I'm seeing in the wine industry is like, how do people have new inputs, new desired outcomes, and do that authentically within the context of being Oregon without getting into the struggle of the old guard and the new wave and how these things work and what's been successful versus what hasn't been successful. But I'm also really inspired by like the work that Greg has done in climate change and like, you know, the language that all the numbers in the 1960s and 70s did not point towards it being a good idea to grow Pinot Noir here. Like that is a wild, and what made that viable was climate change. And so the idea that people getting in new to an industry like myself, following a formula that has been refined and then now can be replicated because of accumulated capital and generational investment, that's not there. That's not available, right? Me as a small producer spending $1,200 on new oak barrels repeatedly to produce that type of Pinot Noir at a margin, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense for me. It maybe could be something that I make at one point. I admire it. Absolutely beautiful as a product and like what's happening, or what's happening in bubbles with Method, right? Absolutely inspiring. A luxury product, right? And these ideas of luxury. I'm not really drawn to winemaking for the luxury aspect of it. I'm drawn to winemaking as a lifestyle, as a community aspect of it, as what I found in Georgia. What I found is like the lubricant of social continuity to this whole society that has persisted in the faces of empire and others, in like a richness and a quality of life. The ability to taste and savor and value and talk with others about what you're experiencing, I think enriches this like level of expression. And if we make the cost of those things not accessible to the masses, there's a problem with that. Now there's ways to stagger and tier and do everything else, right? Capitalism is good at this. Capitalism is good at selling, you know, quality at all different scales and sizes and getting people to pay more money for certain things. But it's just, that's very much on like the back of my mind. And I'm working within the means that I have. I'm not pursuing outside investment. I'm pursuing a scalable project that like I can do. I don't want to supervise people in my side quest. I already supervise people in my life. I don't need that, right? So that's what I'm doing.
Tell me about, let's talk about the future for wine a little bit, kind of on a general scale. Obviously, an interesting time in alcohol and wine right now. What do you see for the future for Oregon wine? What are you hopeful for? What are you excited about? What are you fearful for? What does the industry look like in your eyes in the coming years?
Yeah, the most resonant thing that I've heard in the last year is when I was meeting with Greg at Albacella, and he told me, we need to stop making wine for our parents' generation, and we need to start making wine for this generation. And it couldn't resonate more. And it feels like some of the woes or the challenges that the industry is facing is an inability to be flexible and adaptable. I also don't think that at my scale and what I'm doing, there's any real impact. If anything, there's probably greater opportunities at this given time and place for somebody who's purchasing fruit, right, to be able to do that as people are trying to figure out a way how to make it. And there's openings and flexibility within the system as a whole that allows somebody like myself to try new things or to scale. I'm really interested in Chenin Blanc. I'm interested in pursuing where that is, and like the ability to break loose or get access to certain fruit supplies. Like it's just, it's there. So when he says that, also I think implicit in what that means is like preparing to normalize fine sweet wine and not even advertising it as sweet wine. I was really struck. The Varnums just spent a month in Germany and came back and reported and was like, yes, everyone makes dry wine, but in their collective what's available for sale, like in Germany of wines that are never leaving Germany, 70% of the wines are semi-dry. Only 30% of wines are dry wines. Like most wines have a little bit of sweetness to the point where it might not even be detectable unless you're a winemaker and you really know. But like we're moving into a land where if you want to sell wine, like there's probably going to be a little bit of sweetness in it. And that is, that's interesting. That's why I'm making the slightly off-dry sparkling Riesling that I'm making, which is like, I love Riesling. It's I typically like it dry, right? But people like a off-dry Riesling. They just do. It's time and time again. Like when I've poured in my experimental years, you pour and it's like, somebody who will just tell you, I don't like sweet wine, and you're like, yeah, totally, because nobody likes syrupy. Well, I mean, there is quality syrupy wine too, but that's not what people think about when they're thinking of wine. So I think that's, from my vantage point of also not knowing what I don't know, and I don't know a lot, is the same. But it's kind of what I'm seeing. I'm imagining a future. It leads to me thinking about making things that I wouldn't otherwise make. Only because I think it's like rounding things out. Like you have to be able to make something that's really approachable, because that's just a gateway, especially if you're making more esoteric, curious, interesting things like Coyote's Eyes, more or less, right? Like that maybe you're going to get a certain subset in the door interested in what you're doing, but like at the end of the day, if you're going to pour wine at a festival or other things and no one's ever had an amber wine, instead of knowing what it is that you're doing or being curious, they might just be offended. They're like, this isn't wine. What did you just put in my glass? So, there's a balance. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, last question for you. Tell me about your proudest accomplishment, biggest achievement so far.
My proudest accomplishment so far, this is my slightly tongue-in-cheek, and then maybe I'll give another, is getting Andrew's amphora from his winery to Varnum Vintners, which I hauled in the back of my F-150 pickup truck while strapped down. But it was really interesting, and one of the most what was interesting about that in wine country is I did it. I stopped in downtown Newburgh, and I parked on the side of the road and was checking everything out. And then you get on social media later, and like Carolyn Bergstrom has posted in her story reel on social media, seeing the picture of the amphora in a truck driving down the road, like, look at this, right? And it was like, one, how small the industry is, but then also just how noteworthy people are like observing and watching, and getting that amphora into place while it's clay and like the vulnerability of it like potentially breaking. But we're also doing this with like a tractor forklift, right? Like not like, it was just. So, I mean, that's kind of jokingly. The proudest accomplishment that I really have is this wine, Coyote's Eyes. And it's because the aspiration, it achieved what the aspiration was, which is to make an approachable, clean, precise amber wine. And I feel like I did it right by the idea. And by going about it, I didn't know if I would be able to pull off what it is that I had sought, but it was affirmation about the inspiration of why I'm making wine, and because of Georgia, it authentically connects to tribal stories of place through like flavor profile towards these ideas, and I'm just proud of it.
All the questions that I have for you today, anything I didn't ask that I should have, anything we didn't cover that you were hoping to cover today?
I don't know if I covered Georgia very well. I feel like I kind of glanced off bits and pieces of it. We talked about it. I think maybe just like a summary. I'm trying to think if there's pieces to that. I was so inspired by Georgia. We were there for 10 days. It was like this lesson in affirming all the things that maintain and sustain culture. And so I saw it in terms of food. I saw in terms of song, right? Having beautiful polyphonic singing that they're essentially doing. I saw wine integrated to food in just this really generative way of house wine. Like every single person had family wine, and oftentimes whoever made the best wine were the houses that people gathered at, because there's a tradition that a guest is a gift from the gods. And that, as opposed to in so much of American society, it's like, oh, guests, like there's this fear, this obligation. The idea of being the place where people want to gather is like generative, and it speaks to like you as abundance. And that also really cross-referenced well with me from like tribal teachings, because wealth isn't about what you hoard. Wealth is about what you can offer and give. And it's about this generosity concept. And so while I was in a completely foreign country, I was being reminded and seeing all these parallels of how wine can fit into a cultural framework that looks a lot more like a tribal framework of like teachings and knowings and how those things worked. And that just made my curiosity and desire and need to make wine infectious. To come back and like plan and imagine that. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. Thank you for bringing along wine as well. We appreciate that. We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Sweet.
Thank you.